Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation and kind of hi everyone. All right, so what I'm going to do, I'll say a little bit which concentrates more on, if you like, the anthropological context. Then I'm going to try and give something about the breadth of the project, a little bit. This is definitely not going to be one of those lectures that takes a little microcosm and sort of deals in depth. There's no depth. It's going to be kind of broad, holistic, and as much as possible, kind of the whole thing. And then if there's time at the end, I might say a little about what I think would be interesting sort of points of discussion, if you like, interface between the kind of work that goes on here and the kind of work that we've been involved in. So starting with anthropology specifically, because that's obviously where I come from, I have to admit, when I applied for this grant, I just thought, you know, you apply for grants. You want to do your anthropology and you hope for a grant that enables you to get on with some more research. It wasn't until I got it and I kind of saw the scale of it that I really thought, well, I want to do anthropology, but what actually do we mean by that? Is anthropology merely that which people in the past have done under that label? Or could you argue that a discipline is also the product of, amongst other things, constraints? It's what people have been able to do in the past. If you had different resources, maybe people would have done another kind of anthropology because it would have been possible, and it would have been a bit closer perhaps to some of the claims that the discipline makes about what actually it is. Because anthropology starts off by saying it's this comparative study, it's a contribution to finessing our idea about humankind, etc. When actually, mostly, it's a study of, I don't know, plowshares in Outer Mongolia, or kind of, you know, issues of labour in Tierra del Fuego, etc. It can be a very parochial pursuit. It tends to be called social anthropology, but very individualistic. So I thought, okay, got the resources, let's try and do something different. Anthropology as perhaps it could have been if we'd been able to. So at that point, what one did is one used the ERC grant and also help from other sources, like University in Chile was helping, etc. And we gathered together a group of 9 people. And the 9 people constituted a team in what I call the real sense of a social anthropology. Everybody working together, collectively, and not as the aggregate of individuals alone. So from the beginning, we sat around as a team. We discussed how the project would proceed. We then agreed that we would all go out and do field work in comparable sites around the world. Essentially, we go for what you might call small townish sites, which I really always like the anthropology of ordinariness. So if somebody has a reason to study it, like the big metropole or the tiny little village, we kind of don't do that. It's like places that are a bit in between and where a lot of people kind of actually live. So small town places. And we decided that we all had 15 months to do the ethnography, absolutely classic down the line ethnography. That bit you would recognize as kind of classic, not particularly changed. But the difference was that we would be studying the same thing at the same time. So every month, all 9 of us studying the same topic. All 9 of us writing one in the field about that topic, exchanging, everybody reading the work of everybody else, talking about it, thinking about it, discussing where to go next. So that sense of comparative as well as collaborative matters from the beginning. Right from the beginning, you're doing a piece of work in a place in South India, and you think you understand what social media is doing, but hold on a second, the person working in Trinidad is saying, no, that's not at all what goes on around here. And then you immediately have to think, well, what is it about the way social media is used here that is so specific, and why? So instead of waiting to the end to appreciate that, you have it all the way through. We did that, we came back, and we continued with the same ethos. So we all set to write books based on our experiences. The classic monograph, except in a slightly more popular vein, perhaps than the classic monograph. But all our books have the same chapter headings. They all deal with the same topics, chapter by chapter, with exception of chapter 5, where we finally agreed you kind of burst if you don't have some chance of doing something of your own, right? So you've got your one chapter. But everything else is collective. Again, everybody reads everything. And much of the rest of the production of the material that we use to go on the outside, is non-authored. Most of the stuff we produce doesn't have authorship. It's the team. Everything we produce is open access, and everything is free. So that's the ethos, and the key is to get it back to the populations where we worked. Okay, they are seen as the primary consumers of the research material that we produce. They're the people we've worked with. They're the people we're concerned about. So that's so there's an ethos to this that we think is closer to perhaps what anthropology might have been if it could have been, and we wanted to see if we can carry this through. And the good news is that has now almost to completion. We actually launch at the end of February, and the first 3 books will come out then. And just by chance, UCL started with the first university open access press in the country. So immediately, we're going with them. So we've got all that. I think, though, there's also an affinity between the discipline and the topic of social media. One of the things I used to joke about when we first started, these things were called social network sites. Remember that? And it was a great kind of label, really, because you sort of go and you say, well, if you wanted to explain to people at a party, right, and somebody says, what do you do? And you're an anthropologist. And I study people. I said, well, psychologists study people, sociologists study people. What does anthropology do that's different? And you might have said that, well, other disciplines study people as individuals. Anthropology studies people as social networking sites, viz, kinship, etc., etc. That's what we've always kind of done. So there's an affinity there. Then you might say, well, if you look at the sort of recent trends, theories, ideas in anthropology, there's a lot of interest in people like Bannister Thurn's work, and the idea that relationships are constituted by being visible. It's the visibility that tells you what the relationship is and how it's constructed, etc. And funnily enough, here's a bunch of new forms of whatever you want to call it, communication, etc., that actually has a lot to do with making relationships more visible. And one of the arguments I would probably make at greater length if I had more time is that I think one of the things social media actually does is make the world more anthropological again. As opposed to the trends that we're used to thinking about, which is that everything that happens takes us away from those kinds of relationships towards fragmented individualism, ego-centered networks, etc., etc. A lot of our work would be opposed to the idea that it's simply another step along that particular trajectory. In many ways, it's the reverse, but we'll see if we get to that. Okay, so the Dramatis Personae, as it were, of the work you can see here, and very, very briefly, we have one member of the team here who's only come to shout me down if I misrepresent anything, Juka, who worked in a low-income settlement in Brazil, that kind of the builders, the cleaners, the hotel workers, etc. Nearest would probably be on the one side, now working in northern Chile. Again, Alto Hospicios was voted the worst place to live in Chile. Poor lot, actually. They got dumped in some really awful places, actually. But it was, well, we'll see. It turned out to range in all sorts of ways. Trinidad, which is actually not a bad place to live at all, I know, because I do a lot of work there, was where Juliano Spyer was working. I was there a bit. I was working in the UK. I think that was a short story, but Razvan was working in Italy, and often we're swapping. I mean, Razvan is Romanian, working in Italy. Elisa is Italian, but so she was working in Turkey, because the tradition of anthropology is by and large you kind of swap the ground. Actually, right on the Syrian-Turkish border, probably not a million miles from the plane being shot down a couple of hours ago, but let's not talk about that. South India, it's a place where you've got just villages, and then you've got this huge IT complex, a couple of 100,000 IT workers plonked in the middle of villages. So the whole interest was, what would be the difference in terms of social media between these two varied populations? In China, again, the interest is different. So on the one hand, you've got a Chinese population sort of not far from the birthplace community, quite traditional, quite rural, sort of what you might expect. And then you've got another population consisting of something like 200 million Chinese people who have migrated from rural areas into these factories. and this particular genuine orang was living in one of these factories, one of the factory towns. So actually maybe one of the factories, in order to explore that population. So that's kind of the range. Now, I think what I'm going to do is, one of the ways we've organised our research is we just produced this kind of free e-learning course in a series of 5 weeks. So I'm just going to sort of go through it kind of almost as it will be week by week. So you can see the range of the things we've actually tried to accomplish. Now, already before this project started, I've obviously been working on other internet-related projects and coming up with ideas with regard to how we conceptualize them. Particularly, the last project I've done was on Filipino mothers, working with them here, then tracing the children back in the Philippines. So I got both ends of the conversation. Really, it's a book about to what extent can you be constituted as a mother when essentially the relationship is through the media. You're not actually seeing your children, but they weren't. And within that, it shifts the focus, because already obviously people working in media studies were interested in the interrelationship between the various media they were engaged in. So you had notions like media ecology developing. But for us, the issue is not so much seen abstractly as the relationship between the media, it's the fact you're working with people. And in the course of their lives, they are working out, negotiating the possibilities of that interaction. So the relationship between each of these different media, what we then came to call polymedia, is actually about social analysis. It's about the way in which things like power relations, so the kids don't want to allow their parents to have a certain kind of control because they're teenagers and becoming autonomous, so they choose maybe email with a delayed response as opposed to immediacy. So exploiting what are called affordances, etc., in order to construct a configuration around these things. So the idea was already developing around looking at these things holistically, where the holistic is based on the fact that that is ethnographically what you experience when you're dealing with people. They use everything they can lay their hands on, and they use it in their own configurations for reasons that we can come to understand. So that was kind of there beforehand. But given that we were spending several years on social media, we also wanted to say, what specifically then is social media? And towards the end, we came up with a concept which we call scalable sociality. And briefly, it's like this. Prior to social media, there aren't many kinds of media, but by and large, you have media really populating two ends of the spectrum. So either you have private media like telephone, largely dyadic, largely one-to-one, letters, etc., etc. I talk to you. Or the other end, you have public broadcast. You have television, you have newspapers, you have radio, and so forth. So looking at that compared to the situation we have today, our argument would be that social media is that which has colonized the terrain between these two. And now there is quite a few platforms to choose from. It means that you can actually, to some degree, choose a scale. You can actually have a bigger group or a smaller group. You can have more privacy, less privacy. And you can start to work with those in between. And since for us, coming out of social science, it's really a form of sociality rather than just a form of communication that we're actually studying, it seems reasonable to call this scalable sociality. So to give an example from my own research, when I was looking at the use of social media amongst school children and 4 children, I did a survey of 2,500 school children, where I found, which is actually something I've always claimed, contrary to reports, that Facebook goes up in usage. It just is completely uncool. Only 12.9% can sort of consider it to be their favourite platform. But you've got about 6 different platforms there in use at a given time by most children. I mean, there are others like Tumblr, etc., but they're much, much smaller than the primary 6. Surprisingly, BBM being still quite important for some of the younger kids. BBM, I think, is one of the untold stories around social media. It's a really interesting social media, very important in a place like Trinidad as well, where I've worked. But the point is that if you then analyse the way they use these media, that's when you get a sense of scalable sociality. So you get the sense of Snapchat as something which is really a core group of trusted people. because, 10, 20, because you're sending them the ugliest picture you ever took in your life. And the whole point is, are they going to share it with somebody or are they not? And of course, sometimes they actually will, but then it's okay if it's done in the right kind of fun way. Otherwise, it's kind of not. Then you go up to things like WhatsApp, and inevitably in these classes, at least two. There's the WhatsApp group where all the girls talk about the boys, there's the WhatsApp group where all the boys talk about the girls, and there's the WhatsApp group where both of them are actually together, talking to each other, and usually others besides. Then you go up to things like Twitter, which is the class group. All the class banter goes on. That's where people are kind of horrible to each other, basically. I did a film on something called Twitter Beef, which some of you may have come across, which is, it's an interesting area within school life. Then you go up to Facebook. The point about Facebook now is Facebook is not internal to the school. Nobody uses it in that way. It's basically for where you contact your family, where you contact with people if you're starting to get a job or something, part-time work, or people in the local area, etc., etc. It's much more outer-facing. And then you go up to Instagram, which is the only place where you actually not only accept, but actually want strangers, because you've done a really nice photo. And of course your friends are going to say it's okay, but if somebody from Estonia says it's okay, wow, they found my photo, it's a great photo, etc. So you can see this operating within different groups in different areas, but the point is it exemplifies the way in which we now work with, beyond polymedia, with a configuration of different platforms media, and with I'll come later on to why actually I think the platforms matter so much less than we think, because most of these are genres which flit happily from platform to platform, rather than actually emanating from the specific nature of the platform. I mean, just to give you an example, let me give one more example from them. I live in a world, as most of the people here, where Twitter is about information. Twitter is journalists. It's kind of cold, and it's kind of that's what you do with it, and it's political and all those kind of things. Facebook is kind of the sort of argy-bargy of social life, and it's kind of much closer, and you quarrel, and you make up, and it's friends and the rest of it, etc. Except the people I work with, the kids, if you said that, they think you're mad. Twitter is where you have all the emotional kind of stuff that goes on, where you can make friends, break friends, changes relationships. Facebook's for information and contacting, it's cold, contacting, showing that you look okay to your grandparents, etc., etc. They think it's exactly the opposite. And I think this has always been true of these media. One of the examples we use is, for example, email, that starts off this incredible transformative break in the history of capitalism, where for a century capitalism has tried to keep work isolated from outside relationships, and then it all breaks down because you can't control what's going on in the computer, and even less so obviously with smartphones. And that's what it does, it breaks down the barrier. Except when you get to this generation, what do they use email for? They use email specifically to create a barrier between things like school and home and formal or commercial links, and never, therefore, the personal. They flipped it completely into the opposite way around. And that, I would argue, is quite typical of what goes on in social media, which is why thinking that you can understand these things from the properties of platforms is a problem. And yet, that is again and again what we tend to do. Actually, you need to understand the nature of those relationships in their local context in order to understand why they go the way they go. And the point was, in each place we try and do that. So it was very important, if I was working in England, that if you're going to talk about the Turkish social media, or you're going to talk about the Indian social media, you really need to understand the Englishness of social media here. And boy, is it English. Because once I worked in a village for nearly a couple of years. And at first you realise that it's just, now I'm going to the adults. When social media like Facebook first became developed and adults started populating it, I mean, I think Facebook always had that kind of romance of community. Despite the resistance, there was also a slightly romance of community. Along with like Friends United, bring back the people. We're getting isolated. It's good that we have all these people now reconnecting with us, that we go back to the people we used to know at school, that we can actually see a sense, because everybody believes they've lost community, including the English, until they actually find it again on places like Facebook, and within a few months realise why they really don't want to have that kind of community, bitterly regret it, and actually then realise that social media is actually the solution to that problem. Because the primary use of social media that I was actually investigating was the way in which English people keep other people at a distance. That, what I call the Goldilocks strategy, okay? You've got all these people out there, the cousins you're kind of okay, the people you had a thing with but kind of don't particularly want to anymore, etc., etc. And you don't want to dump them, you don't want to kind of defriend them, but you don't actually want to kind of talk to them, spend time with them, etc., etc. So social media provides a really nice kind of good enough, the Goldilocks position. It's kind of just right. It's sort of tepid, warm, like the weather kind of thing, and very much suits an English sensibility. But the point is you can see it again and again in so many cases in this kind of home counties region. You see how people are using social media to construct that kind of distance, which becomes fascinating in an English context, because if you're doing this to do it in the ethnography of Englishness, which inevitably you are if you're working in the English context, then you start to think about the values of Englishness. In Oxford is kind of Kate Fox terrain, where you have this incredible anxiety around things that actually muddle a clear separation between the public and the private. This is a society which basically everyone met in the street. The idea that they were having profound conversations, and social media has kind of reduced this, is something I've never understood. The things people actually said in the street about the weather, etc., were not, existentialism. But that is where they talked, right? They talked in the street. They do talk behind under garden fence, they really do. But they don't go into each other's houses. They really don't. And there is a very important separation between these things. So the interesting sort of context of this is what happens when you have a society whose values are premised on keeping separation between the public and the private, and a bunch of new media, which was defined how, 10 minutes ago, as that which populates the area between what was previously a dualism of the private and the public. So there is a specific clash set of issues that develop around the Englishness of social media, which is where little Goldilocks, etc., comes in. And actually turns out, because one of the things I also wanted to do in this work is I did a fair amount of applied work. I'll do that for a moment. Fair amount of applied work, and it was interesting that, I spent one day a week for nearly 2 years working for the hospice, looking at older people. And actually, over 50% of the over 65s we were working with were actually using things like Facebook. So it was present there. But what you found was that even in this village situation, considerable amount of loneliness and considerable amount of isolation because of that English concern. Once you retreat back to your house, people do not necessarily follow you there, mainly dealing with people with terminal diagnosis. And that's oddly enough in England, that's almost embarrassing. So, huge amount of volunteering. The hospice where I work has 1,000 volunteers, but not so much help to people you actually know, because that's embarrassing. And how actually this plays, therefore, social media in terms of, again, the kind of unintended consequences of English sensibility is a large part of the story that was taking place here. Okay, so you have an English issue taken up in the first week. The second week, we go to a completely different area, and the main sites that we use to exemplify it are, on the one hand, Italy and Trinidad. And the interest is focused on the rise of the visual, because clearly one of the key implications of social media is simply that communication has got more visual. The amount of images that are used to convey at the expense of text and voice is extraordinary. It's a really significant transformation which we clearly need to understand. And that may, so the person working in South India, for example, or is interested in its relation to literacy, as is Juka working in Brazil, there are specific implications in specific places, but there's also much more general implications. And things like, I'm giving a lecture in a couple of weeks' time in the Royal Anthropological Institute, launching an essay called Photography in the Age of Snapchat, which is only on this photography. And in fact, all our books have chapters specifically on photography, because it's one of the main things we need to emphasize in this kind of analysis, so I just don't have time to go into it here. But you can see how there's an evolution in the way you got the development in early social media, then you get things like emoticons, you get emojis, and by the time you get to Snapchat, it's the human face. I mean, if you compare that, and that, and that, the way people are kind of addressing each other, and you can see the evolving of particular kind of ways of expressing mood and emotion, etc., formulated, but increasingly formulated around the visual. So the textual has become virtually vestigial in a thing like Snapchat. So we examine that, and obviously then you also examine the main tropes that people discuss in looking at the specifics of social media images as they appear on social media. I mean, actually, one of the nice things about this visual is if you're an ethnographer, you can see so much directly. One of our last books will be just a comparison of the visuals in Trinidad and the visuals in England. And almost you can write the ethnography and everything about values just from looking at these thousands and thousands of pictures. Because you've got thousands of pictures, then the task of understanding normativity is a lot easier, because there is so much repetition in the genres of images that come across in this kind of material. You can, if you want to look at the way, say, one last example from England, the parallels between the way males associate with beer and women with wine on social media, you have just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of examples that make it pretty clear. But there's also the more specific kind of images. So, for example, something that's obviously arisen in relation to social media would be something like the meme. What are these? What's going on here? Again, comparing them across the different sites, we came up with a kind of slogan. We described the memes as the moral police of the internet. Because essentially there's two main bodies of meme. There are memes that are funny, and there are memes that are kind of serious, because, for example, one of the main groups that use a lot of memes are religious. Loads and loads of Christian, Hindu, Muslim memes, loads and loads. And loads of funny memes. But the funny memes also tend to be memes that are making comments of one kind or another. Oh, I'll comment later. I will think back to front. You find, they're often like at the expense of some behaviour one disapproves of. A meme is like, there's a whole series we have in Trinidad and Chile based on Kermit the Frog, and it's like, oh, you're going to the gym, but actually while you're going to the gym, this is happening and that's happening, or about pretentiousness, or about claims that people make about themselves, etc. So it's about normativity. It's about how do you control value in a society, either seriously from religion or highly moralistic. Lots of kind of feminist memes, for example, lots of memes about gender relations, and yet other side coming from humour. Look at this politician and what they claim to do. Shows you what behaviour we should be having as opposed to what we should be having. So you can see how the constellation map works in a given situation. But also, you want to pay attention to the variability of these kind of almost icons of social media as they become. And if there is one thing that is iconic of the visual image in social media, it has to be the selfie. But again, once you start analysing the selfie, you get very quickly some distance from the way these are portrayed generically through journalism, etc. And I think a lot of it is because selfie is associated with selfish, it's associated with the individual, etc. Well, actually, even on Facebook that I was studying in England, there were 5 times as many selfies with groups as there were of individuals. A selfie stick helps you show friendship. It can incorporate more people. And the actual kind of glamour selfie, it exists, it certainly exists on Instagram, but it is one genre of selfie and by no means the main one. And in each place you will have different genres and you have to understand the different genres. So you might look at the friendship genre, and of course the ugly, which I mentioned, which as everyone knows is best taken from beneath the chin. Get really good at ugly that way. And circulated on places like Snapchat. Oh, there we have the Kermit the Frog, so that would be a Chilean one and that would be a Trinidadian one. And actually very, very common in these kind of areas. So, because time's moving on, we have a lot to say about the visual, and we use main examples in Trinidad and Italy. We then move on to a week which discusses essentially gender and politics. And the main examples we use for that are the field sites in South India, on the one hand, and the Syrian-Turkish border on the other. And one of the key points is this. We feel there is a problem in the way politics is discussed in this arena, because it's almost too easy to do it. You can get Twitter data. You can look for political postings, and of course you will find thousands of them. And then you can analyze them. But you then extrapolate from that assumptions about what actually role that plays in people's lives, which may be problematic if you haven't actually seen them, as it were, from the bottom up, rather than just seeing them as data. And the point about our project is we sit there for 15 months with people and we see how often politics actually comes up in people's postings. And the answer in most places is actually not very much at all. And when it does in places like England, it's mainly, and actually I think you could say this generally across the sites, social media is mainly social. It's mainly about the relationships, the close relationships you have with other people, or slightly more distant ones. So if you're going to post on politics, the primary concern may not be political at all. It may be about the impact of that on the key relationships. So if it's humorous in England, it's because it's about bonding. It's about, saying that David Cameron's a wanker or whatever, and everyone laughs, and etc., and you bonded with your mates, right? Doesn't even matter what you think about David Cameron. It matters the role that it plays within the general context of social media. Not only that, but as things have become spread and more public, it's the places where the politics is most difficult that you often get the least politics. Why? Because if you're in the Syrian-Turkish border in a strict Muslim society, you are going to be extremely cautious about your posting. So if you looked at social media in that society, if you think that society is conservative, right, as a strict Muslim society, it's nothing like as conservative as Facebook. Facebook is the most conservative representation of that society you're likely ever to find outside of somewhere else in Syria. Because all the things you've now started to do offline, going out and sitting in a restaurant, males and females together, behaving badly at a wedding, which even this, which was kind of a bit more permissible, even you couldn't behave badly elsewhere. None of these can come on Facebook. On Facebook, you post the food you had at the wedding. Because if you post a picture of people, who knows who else is in the background? Who knows what your aunt is going to gossip about as a result of that? Who knows what people are going to say? So you get this extraordinarily conservative construction around public-facing social media. So it's not the politics you expect, it's not the social representation you expect. The one thing, however, that you might have expected is, of course, there's a big difference, because in these same societies, there's also other things going on down below. And down below here is in the private world, of private messaging. Masses of fake profiles, okay? Masses of use of WhatsApp, etc. Because there, in those same societies, anybody who's worked recently, almost anywhere, for example, in the Middle East, I was doing a project on miscarriage in Doha, you can see the same thing. Men here, women there, and you can almost see the air saturated with the messages going back and forth. And every now and then there's a glance there, because you know who's kind of talking to who, kind of thing. But they're not allowed actually to meet, or unless they can find a way to do it. Major transformation in gender relations in many significant ways. Through that, so again, it's which social media are we talking about, which aspect of society are we talking about, which place are we talking about, because it will differ according to the issues of that particular context. Moving on, because very little time, the next week we concentrate on the Chinese social media. Now, Chinese social media are fascinating anyway, I'm not bothered with that, because if you want to do an experiment on social media, it clearly helps if, unlike the rest of the world where you've got your WhatsApps and your Instagrams and your Snapchats, etc., you have another place in the world that has completely different social media. you have the world of QQ and the world of WeChat. Because then there are questions you can ask about to what extent the things you're dealing with are constituted by the nature of the platforms, as opposed to the wider context in which they are found. So the study of these is very interesting, but this was probably one of our key cases where we can make that point about not overgeneralizing the populations as well as not overgeneralizing the media. China's a big place, and fortunately we have this absolutely extraordinary contrast because we have the site that conforms to a lot of the traditional, be it anthropology or general journalistic representations of Chinese society. A site which is very hardworking, very concerned with education, very traditional, takes Confucian values very seriously, obeys the one-child policy, etc., etc., etc. But we also have another site, so that site was where Tom MacDonald was working, and another site where Xin Wang was working, is a factory. These 200 million, it's not a small population, 200 million people. And they don't look like any of these things. They really don't care about education. They're going to work in factories. Why should they care about education? Getting a qualification. It's not worth it. It's of no interest, education. They don't care. They don't care about working hard. They'll get a job. They'll do what they have to do to get a salary. They don't care about the one-child system because they're under the radar. They're so out of the hookah system anyway, nobody knows what the hell's going on. They don't care about what values they're supposed to care about. They are almost the opposite in many ways. I mean, there are obviously some things in common, but there are all sorts of really clear differences in values between these two populations. But one of the key things is what they do care about is what is developing online. Because one of the arguments Xin Wang makes is that in a sense, over this period, you've had two migrations going on. You have a migration from the rural area to the factory, and you have a migration from offline to online. And when you start to look into the details, particularly the new migrants, what's going on with the migration? Not actually even earning much more money by going to the factories because of the other expenses, etc. they have. What they're aiming for is an entry point into a certain model of Chinese modernity. But the place where they're able to realize that is actually mainly not by going to the factories, it's by going online. The worlds they construct online. We thought, Genuine thought, that they would be using social media to connect back to the villages where they came from, and they're not. They're using it to connect forward to their images of what living in Shanghai would be like. So you have the migration is being completed online, whatever is happening kind of offline. They don't even talk to each other that much offline. They're fed up working together all day. Online is really the crucial element in understanding the migration of values of this huge population. And those differences then apply to all the things that we routinely discuss when we're discussing social media. To give some of the typical topics, we discuss privacy, happily, assuming that we need to understand how social media is a great threat to privacy, the end of privacy, the problems of surveillance, etc., etc. And in some societies, indeed, that is what we should be discussing. However, we've also got about half the world, not only in East Asia but also in South Asia, of people who have traditionally lived in extended families, in very intense extended families, who live in what were thought of as communities, where they can't get away from the gossip, they can't get away from the categories in which they have been put by their relatives and friends, they can't get away from the intensity of sociality, and there is no traditional respect for privacy. Nobody knocks on a door before they goes into your room. Like, why would they? What have you got to hide? So actually, the story of social media that matters for much of the world is this may be the first time people have ever experienced privacy. It's the first time they have a sense of what privacy could be compared to anything they've been used to in the past. It's a radically important change, but just as important as the change the other way. And again, you see these kind of differentiations. Education. Half the world, education, threat to social media is a threat. It's a distraction. It's how do you get the kids not to bring their mobiles to school, etc., etc. Other half of the world, Duca will tell you about what people get out of learning from YouTube that they never are going to get from going to school. This is where education now actually is. This is a primary means of actually overcoming the inadequacies of the formal educational sector and getting knowledge and skills. And they're both there. We have to understand them as both there. So again, the impact of social media is relative to the context in which it is found. Commerce. I mean, the thing about social media is like any topic becomes this vast topic because social media permeates so many elements of it. And all sorts of interesting stories. We find a lot of examples of social media being very important for the development of commerce that is very social. That which you could, as it were, sell amongst your friends, and where you can actually exploit that socially, much less possibly from the kind of big abstract commerce that most people actually concentrate on when they're talking about commerce. Indeed, it's not my main area, but I sometimes wonder about this because it seems to me that the main model, the political economy of the internet, if you like now, is increasingly targeted advertising. Try every other business model and it fails. The one thing we can do is we can target advertising, we can use data, we can etc., etc., etc. Which clearly is happening. But I know from my field side that the main time people talk about commerce on social media is because of their hatred of targeted advertising. They don't talk about surveillance from the state. They don't talk about those kind of surveillance. They talk about surveillance from Tesco. Because the problem is with targeted advertising, it is concrete evidence that people know about you. And remember, I'm working with a hospice. People don't want to be reminded that they have cancer. They don't want to be told that there is a product. They want to have another life. So targeted advertising, see, all I can find is it just again and again seems to put people off commerce. I have no idea what the possible implications of that are, but it's kind of interesting, I think. Gosh, we really didn't have much time. So the final week is actually a week about, I never managed to keep with PowerPoint, so it doesn't matter. Let's sort the PowerPoint. The final week is really about Chile and about Brazil and the issues of, again, fantastic contrast really, because we're interested in issues of inequality and equality. We're interested in the generalizations you can make, and if there is one, it would be that there is a fundamental egalitarianism to the access to smartphones. Smartphones do make a difference. They are, in and of themselves, create abilities which can be shared across at one level. But again and again, our evidence shows that if you think that's going to have an impact on offline inequality, it really doesn't. For all sorts of reasons that come up very clearly in our work. And differentiating those two arenas of equality and inequality is kind of central to what we find. But that can then work, again, in many different ways. And that's where the contrast comes in. Because on the Brazilian side, you've got a site of aspiration, low-income people finally getting something like a sort of half-decent domestic environment, wanting to get on in the world, wanting to get education, wanting to get work, and their postings all about that, not to be posted by the bare brick wall, but be posted in juxtaposition to the gym or the swimming pool or something that shows you have an ambition in life. It's who you are, it's who you're going to be. And that matters to people, and social media becomes an element in which you can construct that possibilities, a little bit like the Chinese factory worker, but also different. And so you'd say, well, that's what social media does, until you go to Chile. And then you go to Chile, the site of Alto Hospicio, a similar population in some ways. Again, just now reaching that point where they've got decent housing, semi-decent housing, they've got work in the copper mines, they've got the possibilities of creating the domestic. So what do they do with social media? They do the exact opposite. This is all about creating the normative. It's about we are the most looked down upon community in Chile, but we are proud of who we are, and we despise you metropolitans down there, just as much as you despise us. So we don't want to have your values. We don't want to show off. We don't want to show new consumer goods. We don't want to show people being better than somebody else. We don't want to show competition over status. We want to show that we come together and we are sustaining the values of our new domestic worlds. We actually are not trying to be better or worse than each other. We are creating our own community of values. And of course, if you want to do that, what better tool than social media? Because the one thing that social media clearly does, and goes back to issues of visuality, is it creates an evident normativity. You can see if somebody is trying to show off. You can see if somebody is making claims that you know they cannot actually live up to. You can see if they're putting down other people. Right? It's very evident. So if you want to use it in the Brazilian way, you absolutely can. And each place, of course, and this is kind of where we'll end, I suppose, and each place, it seems that's the obvious thing to do with social media. Let's go, like, it really lends itself to that, okay? You know, it's great for showing aspiration, etc. So you go to the next place, and it's like, it's great for doing the opposite. It's great for preventing that form of aspiration, etc. And the point we have to make, and I think I probably do have to end, is that clearly, at one level, we're anthropologists and we deal in relativism. I don't apologise for that with regard to something like social media, because there are a few topics which are over-universalised as much as the discussion of social media, particularly if you go to journalism and the press, right? Social media is doing this to your brain, or doing this to friendship, or doing this to whatever. So just to get a better starting point, at least we're trying to use this material to recognise that that is not what social media is. If you want to understand it, you've got to engage with this cultural variability. On the other hand, we don't want to end up as, in the classic frame of anthropology, as mere relativists. Now, one of the points about this work is that it has been continually comparative all the way through. So we can try and think about the kind of generalizations that we can make. One of my problems I have with anthropology as a discipline, to be honest, is that anthropologists tend to be very good at their little parochial ethnography. And then when they want to make a big generalization, they'll quote a meta-sociologist, like Giddens or Bauman or a philosopher or big theory or something, which means they kind of don't take the responsibility, actually, for the generalities that they're trying to engage with. And we think it's about time anthropology took that responsibility and actually worked out what kind of relationship between generality and specificity we ourselves create in the knowledge that we create, and actually go out there with that. So one of the things we're trying to do is, at the moment, work out the kind of visualizations of our material in its dissemination in ways that correspond to a sense, right the way through to that research result, of where we can nuance the specificity and the generalization together. Now, I guess 45 minutes is not a lot at a time when you have a project this scale. I have got a bit over time. I didn't want to, because I'm happy to answer questions. It means at least you might feel you have a capacity for depth if you go into something in a bit more detail. But you'd see why I've also tried to give a kind of holistic portrait of this, because I think that's in many ways what is different about this project. It's essentially what it tries to encompass, not just what it tries to do. And I'll stop there.